the irresistible force of the Roman military machine meeting the immovable object of Gaulish independence. Let's dive right into this explainer. It's not just some dusty story about ancient battles. Oh no, this is a brutal, complex masterclass in logistics, psychology, and the absolutely agonizing choices of leadership.
Picture this number, 200,000. That represents the massive Gaulish relief force that converged on the Roman army at Alesia back in 52 BC. We are talking about the greatest Gallic army ever assembled. They had overwhelming numbers, they had the high ground, and man, they had the fury. So, how in the world were they completely crushed by a Roman force that was just a fraction of their size?
Well, to understand exactly how that happened, we're going to follow this roadmap today. First, Caesar meets his match. Then, tribal warriors versus the Roman machine. Third, the scorched earth paradox. Fourth, the engineering terror at Alesia. And finally, number 5, the chieftain's impossible choice.
All right, let's jump straight into section 1, Caesar meets his match. Now, before we get to that insane climax at Alesia, we really need to understand the powder keg that Gaul had become. Caesar shows up in 58 BC, and for a while he's expertly playing all these rival tribes against each other, but by 52 BC, the Gauls push back hard. Just look at this staggering escalation. Rome breaches the walls of Alvaricum, which ends in the horrific massacre of 40,000 people. But then, almost immediately after at Gergovia, the Gauls pull off this stunning victory. They inflict heavy casualties and basically prove to everyone that, hey, Caesar's unstoppable legions, they bleed just like anyone else. And the architect behind all of this resistance? A guy named Vercingetorix. His name literally translates to the over-king of great warriors. Now, he managed to pull off the near impossible, uniting these fiercely independent rival tribes. How'd he do it? Well, through sheer, ruthless discipline. He actually demanded hostages to guarantee loyalty, and he forced a kind of strategic unity that the tribal councils had just never seen before. It was brilliant, really. But here's the catch. He was essentially fighting the very DNA of his own society. Which brings us right to section 2, tribal warriors versus the Roman machine. You see, this wasn't just a clash of swords and shields. It was a violent collision of entirely different social structures. Caesar's legionaries were this highly standardized, engineering-focused machine. We're talking 16 to 20-year career professionals, soldier laborers who fought in tightly disciplined cohort units under a strict centralized command. And against them, the Gauls, they were totally decentralized, led by local chieftains, and fought in these individual warrior bands where your personal honor and that headlong, terrifying charge mattered way more than, staying in a neat little formation. So to even match Caesar's numbers, a massive democratization in Gaulish warfare suddenly had to happen. Historically, their armies were basically just elite aristocratic retinues. But now, all of a sudden, untrained peasant levies and craftsmen are getting drafted into the mix. While this absolutely gave Vercingetorix the massive numbers he needed, it created a severe logistical nightmare. I mean, these new recruits lacked training, they lacked proper weapons, and most importantly, they completely lacked discipline. And that leads us to section 3, the scorched earth paradox. Because fighting a professional army forces you to make some truly unthinkable choices. To put things in perspective, the daily consumption of Caesar's logistics system is it's almost hard to wrap your head around. A single Roman legion, that's roughly 6,000 men, needed nearly 5 tons or 4,900 kilograms of grain every single day. Add to that the cavalry, which needed thousands of kilos of barley and huge swaths of pasture for the horses. Vercingetorix knew for a fact he'd lose an open field battle against that machine, so he targeted this exact vulnerability. He went right for Rome's stomach. But to do that, Vercingetorix had to issue a horrific, paradoxical order. He essentially told his own people that they had to burn their own farms, their granaries, their villages, all to starve Caesar out. But here is the chieftain's dilemma, right? To starve the Romans, the Gauls had to set a ticking clock on their own survival. I mean, a massive coalition of hundreds of thousands of people couldn't just live off the ashes of their own country forever. So, to survive the very fires they set, the Gauls retreated to these fortified hill towns known as Oppida. Now, on paper, it makes total sense, right? Take the high ground, secure the fortress. But tragically, they basically locked themselves in a cage. By hiding behind those walls, they stopped moving, which played exactly into Rome's ultimate mastery, relentless, inescapable siegecraft. Let's move to section 4, the engineering terror at Alesia. This brings us to the climax, where Roman labor was weaponized on a scale that honestly defies belief.
21 kilometers. That is the staggering length of Caesar's outer wall at Alesia. He had already trapped Vercingetorix inside the city with an 18-kilometer inner wall, but knowing that a 200,000-strong relief force was on its way, Caesar's engineers simply built another wall facing outward. They completely encased themselves in this massive protective donut of wood and earth. When in doubt, Rome just builds more walls.
And we aren't just talking about walls here. The ground itself was laced with psychological terror traps. There were deep trenches filled with 5 rows of sharpened branches called sippi, 3-foot pits hiding fire-hardened stakes, and my personal nightmare, the stimuli. These barbed iron hooks literally buried in the earth to shred the feet of charging warriors. For a Gaulish culture that highly valued heroic, face-to-face combat, dying on an invisible iron hook in the mud was an absolute psychological nightmare. It totally stripped the glory out of the fight.
As this walls closed in and the food supply evaporated, Vercingetorix sent his cavalry away in the dead of night to beg the rest of Gaul for help. His plea really highlights just how fragile and desperate this coalition was. He reminded them, pleading, that 80,000 chosen men were trapped in there with him, doomed to perish if that relief force failed to break through. Which brings us to our final section, Section 5, the chieftain's impossible choice.
Inside Alesia, time had officially run out. Faced with only 30 days of rations, Vercingetorix had to make a completely horrific call. He expelled the civilians, the very people whose city he had actually commandeered, hoping that Caesar would just let them pass through the lines to safety. But Caesar applied the merciless, cold logic of war and refused. Those civilians were left to slowly starve in the no-man's land between the 2 walls, right in full view of their families. It was a devastating humanitarian failure that completely broke the rebellion's spirit.
And what about that massive relief force outside the walls? Well, it failed entirely because of a fatal crisis of command. It was basically leadership by committee, 4 different tribal leaders who just couldn't coordinate a sustained attack. Way too many cooks in the kitchen. They surged forward in these uncoordinated waves, while Caesar, who held absolute centralized authority, simply shifted his reserves around to patch the line wherever he needed. Eventually, he launched a devastating cavalry counterattack that completely shattered the disorganized Gauls. So, it leaves us with this profound question. Can a decentralized society ever defeat a standardized military machine? It's a fascinating paradox, because to actually defeat Rome, Gaul had to adopt Roman discipline, Roman logistics, and Roman centralized command. In short, to defeat Rome, they had to become Rome. And that was a sacrifice their fiercely independent society would never, ever make. In the end, the Roman shovel proved deadlier than the Gallic sword. Definitely something to think about the next time you see a clash between rigid structure and decentralized passion. Thanks for exploring this explainer with me, and I'll see you in the next one.